My wife was excited that evening, in a way that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. She spoke about the dinner as if it were an opportunity, not a meeting, repeating that her uncle mattered, that his presence carried weight, that this night was important. Her tone was light, almost proud, and I listened without interrupting, sensing that expectations had already been set before I entered the room. When we arrived, the atmosphere confirmed everything. Before a handshake was offered, his identity was announced to the table, not through his name, but through his origin. He was introduced as the son of a bank president, and that detail alone reshaped the room. Bodies leaned forward, smiles adjusted, voices softened. In that instant, I stopped being a guest and became an object of assessment. Conversation flowed around credentials and achievements, each story carefully placed like a badge. The first direct question came quickly, delivered with a pleasant smile that carried quiet intent. They asked what I had studied. I answered simply and without hesitation. High school. No explanation followed, because none was needed. The response arrived immediately. A brief laugh escaped someone near the window, followed by another across the table. It was not cruel or aggressive. It was relaxed, confident, shared. That reaction spoke louder than any insult could have. They were comfortable judging me, comfortable ranking me, comfortable deciding my place before dinner was even served. I noticed how the energy shifted after that. Questions redirected away from me. Conversations no longer paused for my input. I was present, but no longer included. My wife remained quiet, her excitement slowly tightening into stillness. No one defended me, and no one needed to. The decision had already been made. In that moment, clarity settled in. I had not been invited to earn respect or exchange ideas. I had been invited to be measured against a standard designed without me in mind. As plates were placed on the table and laughter resumed, I understood something essential. This evening was not about connection. It was about comparison, and I had already been assigned my position. That realization stayed with me long after the night ended. I left the house knowing silence had taught me more than any conversation could, and that first impressions often reveal less about truth than they do about fear, hierarchy, and the quiet rules people obey without ever questioning. They never attacked me openly, and that was what made it effective. Instead of insults, they used conversation as a weapon, steering every exchange toward education, credentials, and pedigree. Each story circled back to universities, alumni dinners, and professional circles I was clearly excluded from. It felt deliberate, as if the table itself had agreed that my value could be measured by academic history alone, without asking anything else about the man sitting quietly among them that night together silently. One of them leaned forward with a polite smile and asked if stopping at high school had been a difficult decision. The sentence sounded gentle, but it landed heavy. I understood immediately that the question was not about curiosity or struggle. It was a verdict wrapped in manners, a way to confirm that my path was considered incomplete, questionable, and unworthy of the same respect freely given to framed diplomas and familiar surnames seated around that table that evening together. After that moment, the room changed its rhythm. Conversations moved faster, skipping past me without pause. When I spoke, replies were brief, polite, and quickly redirected elsewhere. No one asked what I had built, how I sustained my life, or why I appeared so calm. Those questions did not matter to them. In their world, education defined worth, and without it, silence became my assigned role for the remainder of that carefully managed social evening inside their circle. Only then. What struck me most was my wife's stillness. She listened, smiled faintly, and said nothing. Her silence felt heavier than their words, because it confirmed that this judgment was acceptable, even expected. I realized she had grown accustomed to measuring people through the same lens, not out of cruelty, but habit. That night, I saw how easily love can pause when status enters the room and takes control without warning, explanation, resistance, or reflection from anyone present there. Then quietly. By the end of the evening, my education had become a sentence passed without trial. I was labeled, sorted, and understood according to rules I had not agreed to. Yet beneath the calm surface, something shifted inside me. I understood that the same system judging me was blind to everything it could not categorize. And for the first time, I recognized that their certainty was not strength, but limitation disguised as confidence shared openly at that table earlier tonight alone. At some point in the evening, The conversation naturally drifted toward money. It always does in rooms where confidence is inherited and risk is theoretical. They spoke about banks they trusted, advisors they kept close, and investments discussed over private lunches. Their voices carried certainty, as if financial stability were a birthright rather than a responsibility learned over time through pressure and consequence. Someone eventually turned toward me and asked, almost casually, where I banked. The question sounded harmless, but I recognized the underlying curiosity. I answered plainly, without embellishment or hesitation. There was no reaction at first, just a brief pause while they placed my answer within their internal hierarchy and decided how it fit alongside their expectations. Then I added one more detail, delivered calmly, without emphasis. I mentioned that I was planning to close my account soon. The effect was immediate. Laughter surfaced around the table, relaxed and confident, the kind that assumes agreement from everyone present. It was not disbelief, and it was not surprise. It was dismissal, served with ease and certainty. One of them leaned back in his chair, smiling as if explaining something obvious. He spoke about how people like them do not simply close accounts, how relationships with banks are preserved, protected, respected. The implication was clear. Movement belonged to those with authority, not to someone whose education they had already reduced to a limitation. That moment stayed with me, not because of the laughter itself, but because of what fueled it. They assumed money belonged to a specific image, a familiar background, a recognizable pedigree. In their minds, capital followed names, not decisions. It followed history, not strategy. Anyone outside that picture was expected to observe, not act. As the conversation continued, they spoke freely again, confident the subject had been settled. I listened carefully, noting how certainty often replaces understanding. I realized then that their greatest weakness was not arrogance, but assumption. They believed they could recognize power by sight, by speech, by education. They never considered that control can exist quietly, unseen, waiting for the right moment to move. That laugh revealed more than they intended, because it exposed a rigid worldview where authority never travels quietly. Sitting there, unnoticed and underestimated, I understood patience was my advantage, and that timing, not permission, decides when leverage finally speaks. No one asked why I remained calm while the room quietly ranked me. No one wondered why I never defended myself or tried to explain anything. They noticed my silence, but misunderstood its source. To them, quiet meant discomfort, and restraint meant uncertainty. They never considered that calm can come from preparation rather than fear, or that patience is often learned through experience rather than education. As the evening progressed, I listened more than I spoke. I watched how questions were used as signals rather than tools, and how confidence was rewarded even when it lacked substance. Degrees were mentioned like passports, granting automatic authority. Silence, on the other hand, was treated as absence. They assumed that anyone with real standing would speak quickly and often, announcing value before it was requested. What they never asked was how I had learned to operate without noise. They never asked where my understanding of capital came from or why I seemed unaffected by their judgments. They assumed knowledge lived in textbooks and lecture halls. They never imagined it could be forged through exposure, repetition, and decisions made without witnesses or applause. They did not know I had spent years observing how money truly moves, not through theories or forecasts, but through signatures, delays, and leverage. I learned who approves transactions and who merely presents them. I learned who waits in silence and who mistakes urgency for authority. Most importantly, I learned that access matters more than appearance, and control rarely announces itself. At that table, confidence was louder than competence, and familiarity was mistaken for mastery. They rewarded the ability to speak convincingly rather than the ability to execute quietly. While they discussed systems they trusted, I thought about structures they never questioned. That was the difference between us, though none of them thought to ask. By the time the night ended, their curiosity had exhausted itself without ever touching the truth. They left satisfied with their conclusions, unaware of how incomplete those conclusions were. I left with confirmation. The room valued presentation over substance, certainty over depth, and recognition over control. That understanding stayed with me, not as frustration, but as clarity that would prove useful later. What mattered was not correcting them, But recognizing that environments obsessed with display rarely notice the quiet mechanisms that decide outcomes long before applause begins. The call arrived late in the evening, long after offices had closed and assistants had gone home. Moments like that never respect schedules, because real decisions are not made for convenience. I recognized the number immediately and stepped away from the room, not out of urgency, but habit. Important confirmations arrive quietly, without ceremony, and this one carried the weight of years spent waiting without ever announcing what was coming. Nothing about it invited reaction or witnesses beyond myself alone. There was no celebration, no deep breath, no sense of victory spilling outward. I listened, asked 2 precise questions, and received clear confirmation in return. The account was closed, fully executed, and transferred under my authority without complication. 7 billion moved as numbers on a screen, detached from emotion. I thanked the voice on the line, ended the call, and sat still, allowing the silence to settle. No handshake, no applause, no moment designed for memory or storytelling afterward quietly. There was no reason to inform anyone from that dinner table. No message was sent, no clarification offered, no satisfaction shared. I did not replay their laughter or imagine their reactions. Power does not require an audience to exist. It simply operates, whether recognized or ignored. That night, I went home, spoke normally with my wife, and slept without revisiting the moment, knowing movement had already occurred. Some outcomes deserve privacy, especially those earned through restraint and long patience alone. The following days passed without visible change. Meetings continued, conversations resumed, routines stayed intact. Yet beneath that normal surface, something irreversible had shifted. Control had moved, access had consolidated, and authority had aligned behind a single signature. I did not feel larger, louder, or superior. I felt lighter, because uncertainty had been replaced by confirmation. Years of preparation had finally condensed into one quiet outcome. It required no validation, no explanation, and no reaction from anyone else at that time. Men who understand power do not rush to explain it, justify it, or display it. They allow results to speak when necessary and remain silent when silence serves them better. That day, nothing about me changed outwardly, and that was the point. The most decisive moments rarely look dramatic. They look ordinary, almost forgettable, while quietly rewriting positions, relationships, and futures long before anyone realizes what has truly happened. By then, consequences were already set in motion permanently for all. Weeks passed after that dinner, and nothing appeared different on the surface. Life moved forward with its usual rhythm, yet beneath it I sensed a shift forming quietly. Messages that once arrived casually now came with careful wording. Invitations were phrased differently, as if every sentence had been weighed twice before being sent. The confidence that once filled the room had softened into something more cautious. Questions began to change as well. They were no longer direct or dismissive. Instead, they circled around topics, probing without committing. People asked about my schedule rather than my background, about my availability rather than my credentials. The laughter that once followed my comments vanished completely, replaced by polite pauses and thoughtful nods that acknowledged presence without revealing intent. It became clear that someone had checked. Not openly, not dramatically, but thoroughly. Information had traveled quietly, the way it always does among people who rely on discretion more than noise. Someone had connected pieces they previously ignored and realized their assumptions no longer aligned with reality. No one explained it to me, but explanation was unnecessary. I noticed the difference most in their tone. Conversation slowed when I spoke. Words were chosen with care, as if they now carried weight. Curiosity replaced dismissal, and respect appeared without being requested. No one joked about education anymore. No one spoke over me. The room adjusted itself without instruction or confrontation, which revealed more than any apology could have. There were no apologies offered, and I did not expect any. Men who adjust do not always admit why. They simply adapt once they understand the ground has shifted beneath them. What mattered was not regret, but recognition, even if it remained unspoken. Silence, once used against me, now worked in my favor. That experience clarified something I had learned long ago. Power does not demand acknowledgement, and it does not announce arrival. It forces recalibration quietly, altering behavior before explanations are formed. Weeks after that dinner, without a single word spoken aloud, I understood that influence had moved. Not because I insisted on it, but because reality eventually corrects every false assumption. That change lingered, steady and irreversible, shaping future interactions without resistance. From then on, every exchange carried restraint, proving that authority reveals itself not through confrontation, but through the quiet correction of those who misjudged its presence for far too long in the beginning there. That night, the house felt quieter than usual. Not tense, not cold, just still. After everything that had happened, my wife finally spoke without distraction or defensiveness. She did not rush her words. She admitted she had been embarrassed, not by my education, but by how easily the room had shaped her silence. Hearing that mattered more than any apology. She explained that she had grown up believing respect followed titles and degrees automatically. That evening forced her to confront how deeply that belief ran. Watching people dismiss me so effortlessly had unsettled her, not because she agreed with them, but because she realized how quickly she had stepped aside. She said she never imagined that a quiet man could carry that much weight without announcing it. I listened without interrupting. There was no reason to argue or correct her. Truth spoken calmly does not require resistance. I told her that silence is often mistaken for weakness, especially in environments obsessed with display. Some people speak loudly to be seen. Others stay quiet because they already understand where they stand. That difference is learned through time, not education. She sat with that thought for a while. Then she admitted something harder. She had underestimated patience. She had believed security came from visibility rather than restraint. That night had shown her that influence does not always look impressive, and that strength can exist without performance. The realization unsettled her, but it also brought clarity. I did not punish that honesty. Long marriages are not built on winning arguments or proving points. They survive on moments where truth is allowed to land without consequence. That conversation mattered because it reset understanding, not hierarchy. It reminded us that respect inside a marriage must remain independent from outside approval. By the end of the night, something shifted between us. Not dramatically, not emotionally, but firmly. She saw that evening differently now, not as embarrassment, but as instruction. That dinner taught her something education never could. That quiet men are not absent. They are deliberate. And once that lesson is learned, it changes how silence is heard forever. It was not about wealth or validation. It was about understanding how easily judgment replaces curiosity and how maturity begins when assumptions are questioned. That awareness stayed with us, steady and lasting. Long after the conversation ended quietly together, they laughed at a high school graduate because that was the only version of me they recognized. To them, education explained everything and absence of titles explained the rest. They believed power always introduced itself early, spoke confidently, and wore familiar symbols. That belief made them comfortable judging quickly and moving on without hesitation. They never laughed again once reality corrected their assumptions. Not because I explained myself or demanded recognition, but because movement happened beyond their control. Power did not raise its voice or seek validation. It listened quietly, waited patiently, and chose its moment without asking permission from anyone. This story is not about humiliation turning into revenge. It is about time revealing structure and patience exposing limits. Degrees impress rooms because they are visible and easy to rank. Silence, however, builds leverage slowly, away from applause, through consistency, discipline, and decisions made when no one is watching. Men over 40 understand this lesson instinctively, even if they never articulate it. Life teaches that noise fades and credentials age, but outcomes remain. The quiet years of preparation matter more than the moments of recognition. What lasts is not what is announced, but what is secured without permission. I did not return to that table to explain myself or reclaim dignity. There was nothing to prove once understanding shifted internally. Respect that depends on explanation is fragile. Respect that emerges from recalibration is permanent. That distinction is the real inheritance left by this experience. The lesson remains simple and difficult at the same time. You do not owe clarity to people who judge quickly. You owe patience to yourself and discipline to your path. When power finally moves, it does not correct the past. It quietly replaces it. That is why this story lingers longer than any apology ever could. Apologies fade once circumstances change, but understanding reshapes behavior permanently. They laughed because they misunderstood the rules. They stopped laughing when those rules no longer protected them. And that silence was louder than anything they had said. It proves that dignity does not need defense, only time. In the end, silence was not absence, it was position. And once position is revealed, explanations become unnecessary forever. This is the message meant to remain with those who listen closely, because maturity understands that the strongest responses are rarely spoken and never rushed by men who have lived long enough already.